Hello, everyone. My name is Rochelle Innocent, and I'm the founder and CEO of Project Purpose. Welcome to our channel. Our community is focused on fostering the intellectual and character development in children. We do this through our parent-child workshops that are focused on 4 themes: autonomy, self-efficacy, compassion, and self-concept, in order to cultivate grit, perseverance, and resilience in each child. And we are so thrilled to be offering one of the first of its kind digital, virtual, and continuous learning environments, enabling parents and children to connect from all around the world. At Project Purpose, our overarching mandate is to renew and rebuild family, community, and relationships. Our different social media platforms provide us with an opportunity to have discussions and to create space on all topics that relate to family, community, and relationships with ourselves as well as with others, with a primary focus on mental health and education. More precisely, the ways that the institutions of mental health and education play a role and have played a role in our societies at large. These discussions and debates provide us with an opportunity to think critically about what needs to change within these structures for us to live up to our bold slogan: support, protect, and empower each child through youth-focused development, better known as leadership in juvenescence. We recognize that in valuing our children's leadership potential, this also translates as recreating and co-creating environments, both socially and politically, that will enable our children to thrive. For those of you who are particularly keen on the topic, we also write thought pieces every other Sunday. We actually have one scheduled to drop this upcoming Sunday, so be sure to meander over to the website and check out our online content. Now, if it is the case that you are looking for a listening alternative, well, we're available on 12 different podcast platforms for your listening leisure, and we provided you with access to the links in the description down below. Now, as is the convention, be sure to subscribe, hit that post notification bell so that you are aware of every time we post. And of course, if you like these conversations and you want to keep them going, like, comment, and share this segment. Let's get into it. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another segment here on Project Purpose. For those of you who are new, we cover topics that relate to mental health, mental wellness, and education on a week-by-week basis. And today our topic of discussion is education. And on the topic of education, I'm going to be talking a little bit about myself. So I very rarely talk about myself, my journey, why it is that I am on here having conversations on the topics that we talk about, and what experiences have brought me to here and now. So I think that there's a lot of questions unanswered, and this is mostly with my actual network outside of Project Purpose, so the people who have met me in real life. I mean, there's so many things that I think that I've left unanswered for a really long time because I really wasn't ready to address them. So in this video, I'm here to address those topics. I'm here to give you a little bit more of an in-depth analysis of me as a human being and some of the experiences, the pivotal moments that have brought me to here and now. So where do we begin? I think it's important to recognize that my convictions around having conversations around mental health, wellness, and education, they come from my background, my family background, and the fact that everyone in my family has had their own convictions around mental health and creating impact and making a difference. And I've spent a lot of my life trying to figure out how that could potentially work for me, and I found that this is the niche that works best. And so for those of you who don't know, I am someone who has come from a narcissistic family dynamic. So I talked a little bit videos how I've gone no contact, and I've had a few questions. Well, how can you talk about, restoring family, restoring relationships if you've gone no contact? And I think that it's important now that I feel I've done enough healing that I can have a conversation to talk a little bit about my family dynamic. So I guess let's start at the beginning. So my mother was married as a teenager. So she was married at 16 years old, and she was married to my father, who was 7 years older. So yes, he had to sign a waiver in order to be able to marry my mother. So already we cue unhealthy dynamics there. And I think we have a lot of people online talking about, these marriages and, maturity and how that plays into marriage, and some concerns around the age gap. And I can say, as being a product of such a marriage, that there is definitely a high degree of power and domination that is involved in marriages or in unions that have that kind of age gap that young, right? So I don't think that power dynamic, that need to dominate, necessarily translates when we're older and we have decided to choose a partner who's significantly older than us. But I think when we're younger, we don't necessarily have the life experience to really understand what it is that we're committing to outside of the lens that we're provided by the person that we're committing to specifically, right? So I think that was definitely the experience, and it wasn't a wedlock situation. It was definitely something that I think at that time, based on the stories that I've been told, because clearly I wasn't born yet, that I think that, there was a strong conviction that this was the right step forward. And I think that began a journey of course, power dynamics. There was a lot of power dynamics there. There was a lot of trauma that was created in that setting. But by the time I came around, I didn't personally witness any of the power dynamics, any of the domination that took place, any of the abuse that took place in the household that built into the foundation of my parents' marriage, but definitely translated in the way that I personally was raised. So I would say that as a middle child, I was a little bit more so the forgotten child. And I recognize now as an adult that there are so many blessings inherent in not necessarily being the focal point of the attention of two people who are trying to heal from their own traumas. And I think that there is a lot of layers of generational trauma that speaks to my personal story, that speaks to the stories of the parents and the people who raised me and brought me here. And I think that there's a lot of victory there, right? So I think that my father was the first to go no contact. He is the last of 12 children across 4 wives, right? So his father had 4 wives. He's the last child of the last wife, and he suffered a lot of abuse and a lot of trauma as part of his upbringing that I think he internalized and wanted to do better in his life. So I think that him moving to Canada, him marrying my mother, I think that he had the intentions to do better. And given the father he was to me, I think that he made leaps and strides over and above what he came from. And to say that, my father did come from a family that was well to do by way of financial means. I mean, his father owned lots of different properties, was a landlord, owned lots of dojos. So actually my father was a martial arts kid. All of his siblings were into martial arts. And in fact, even as his siblings migrated to either the United States or to Canada, most of them opened martial arts studios and they were teaching martial arts. And it was part of how I was raised. I was raised watching lots of ninja movies. I was raised learning different martial arts, never formally, because I think my father saw that I picked up on it. And it's one thing to have a child who likes to be a little bit scrappy but doesn't know how to formally hit someone. But when you have a child who's really keen on picking it up, and I was sidekicking my siblings in the face or knee dropping them, I think they realized that it was probably best to focus extracurricular activities in different venues or different arenas. But on my father's side, I did come from a long line of fighters, and from my father's stories, from some of the discipline that he expected. I saw myself as a child of a fighter, right? When my father said, this is my child, I saw myself as this fighter, and I really had a lot of pride and conviction in being able to defend myself. Now, when we think about my mother's side of the family, I think that there is a lot of narcissistic abuse that took place, right? And it was very generational. So my mother, a lot of how she raised me was really about how she was trying to heal from her own trauma. So I knew that if ever there was an adult who was trying to dominate over me or trying to abuse her authority over me, that my mother would definitely speak up because it triggered her trauma, because she felt that her mother never came to her defense. But then when it came to me being traumatized by my peers and coming to her and seeking to support and seeking defense when it came to some of the experiences that I was having with people who were more lateral to me and more experiencing the same kind of childhood experiences as I was, then it was about competition. I never felt that she could acknowledge my trauma without feeling as though it was competing with her trauma. And I felt throughout my childhood that I was competing with her trauma, that I couldn't be heard, that I couldn't get the support that I was looking for. I couldn't get the defense that I was looking for because it somehow threatened her narrative around the trauma that she experienced, and she needed her trauma to be more severe than my own. And I think that when it came to me, I was homeschooled intermittently. I was raised in a very rural area. I was very, very sheltered. There was a lot that I didn't know that my peers knew. And that gap, that level of delay that took place meant I really couldn't keep up with my peers because I was really out to lunch. I really was very ignorant to a lot of different topics that they were really well versed in. And so when I experienced my own trauma, I was for the most part without defense, right? Because I didn't know how to defend myself. I didn't know know really what trajectories to take other than telling my parents. And in telling my father, I think he was dismissive. He thought it was part of the growing pains of growing up. And with my mother, like she couldn't acknowledge my trauma and my experiences without her feeling that it was threatening her trauma and her experiences. And I think that that is a lot of the dynamic that took place, right? There was a lot of competition that existed between myself, my sister, and my mother. I mean, she did her best to triangulate. I wasn't receptive to triangulation, to being compared to or to be pit against my siblings, but I think that they were responsive to that. And I was more so on my own path. And when I realized that I was alone in dealing with the experiences that did traumatize me, so some of the bullying that took place that I had mentioned earlier, it really just severed a lot of the emotional connectivity that I had to my parents because I felt that I had to be my own parent. I really, at that point, took on the role of making sure that I was safe and keeping myself in check. And I changed the rules, right? So where it was, toe the line, listen to authority. I mean, I changed the rules of that a lot because for me, the visceral trauma that I experienced with my mom was her own trauma came from authority figures, people who were in positions of power, who were protected in the way that they abused her because she wasn't, right? Like she didn't have a voice because she was a child, but as a child was abused by a lot of people who knew better. And having that narrative always kind of spoken in my ear, I had a deep distrust of authority. I also, now with my own experience being bullied and having had no one come to my defense, felt doubly confident that authority wasn't to be blindly trusted. And so rather than just completely throw away the hatchet and not respect authority at all, I looked for authority to earn the respect that they were looking for. And I respected authority on a merit basis. And that was, of course, a revolt in and of itself because that just was not the norm when I was a teenager, but it was my norm. People adapted around it. I had my own anger. I had my own, sense of social justice arising from that. And because my parents were much more focused on the image of being good parents, on the image of having everything together and having everything under control, it was much easier for them to just let me fly off the handle and then count on the pity and the sympathy from people around them who thought that I was just, a spiraling teenager, right? So it was easier to paint a narrative as me being the problem child rather than to deal with the trauma that was really driving a lot of the behaviors that I had, where I was combative against the people that I thought were really trying to infringe on my own sense of agency at that point in time. So I think that it was the dynamic, right? I was comfortable being picked as the problem child for being argumentative, for being combative, for standing my ground, for establishing my boundaries. And so long as, I stayed in my own lane and I didn't speak too much about some of the unhealthy, toxic, abusive dynamics that were taking on in my family household, it was fine that way. And I think that also because my parents were married throughout my adolescent years, I was protected from a lot of the competitive aspects of my mother, which got worse as I became a teenager. I think my father shielded me from a lot of what it could have translated into. It was still unhealthy, right? So I still left when I was quite young. I moved out of my parents' house when I was 19. And I tried my best to be just independent. I tried my best to really create a life for myself on my own without really having a lot of periphery on what real life was like. So moving to the city, I really didn't understand this whole idea about neighborhoods having status associated to it. I didn't understand that, you were judged by the neighborhood you lived in. And I didn't understand the concept of a bad neighborhood because I had never lived in a bad neighborhood growing up. And I think a lot of the filters or the cataracts came off in my master's program because now I have a worldly view. I have people from all over the world, from so many different walks of life, really challenging my view of the world around me, right? My view of the world around me was as big as Toronto, which is not a big city. Now that, in retrospect, having lived Paris and Lisbon, I recognize that Toronto really is not a big city by comparison. And I just recognize just how ignorant and naive I was. And I think that it made me just all the more susceptible to being targeted and to being victimized by people who had the same profile that my parents did. And I think that as I was growing and really building my own confidence and building my own identity, a lot of it was through missteps, right? Through understanding how things operated at different levels because of people that I was coming into contact to, right? But I still had my own beliefs around certain things. I had my own convictions and I never really saw there being a problem with me saying no. So I think while I had a lot of narcissistic injuries that I think people could definitely pick up on, I also had a lot of healing that had already taken place because I had moved out at such a young age. So I think that it was a lot of mixed signaling. So I would attract people who wanted to kind of inflict some injuries on me based on my healing journey and based on, like, I guess, frequency that I was putting out, because I was raised in a narcissistic dynamic. But I think that there's confusion there because I always pushed back against my mother. I always established boundaries. I was always very vocal about the way I expected to be treated, and I was able to set the standard for my treatment with my family. So I think what the term is, like, the black sheep of the family, but I was the truth teller of the family. I didn't experience a lot of what my siblings experienced and a lot of what I could have potentially experienced because of who I was and because of how convicted I was in my truth, and because my parents knew that I really didn't care about image, right? I was happy to blow the gasket and let people know really some of the toxic behaviors, and for me it was this, psychological, emotional abuse that was taking place behind closed doors. Despite the fact that my parents were seen as like these great parents, they were seen as very highly commendable within their circles. Just simply didn't translate behind closed doors. Behind closed doors, there was a lot of abuse, there was a lot of competition, or a lot of silence. There was a lot of negligence that took place. More so talking about my relationship with my mother. Like, if she wasn't competing with me, then, she was trying to relive her adolescence through me, right? If it wasn't her trying to relive her adolescence through me, it was her trying to have her identity extend in my experiences. And I just wasn't having any of it. And I was able to curb it as much as I possibly could have. And I think I was able to limit her access to me while I was, dealing with my primary professional experiences, while I was finishing my undergraduate experience. And I went no contact, mostly because the pandemic, right? So just as the pandemic was escalating, I decided to move back home. I was living in France, in Paris at the time. I decided to move back home as I was figuring out my next steps. And then the pandemic hit, which really put a wrench in all of my plans. And I think that for me to see that my mother saw my not having an employment, just moving back from France, my living at home now so long after I had moved out as a teenager, she saw it as an opportunity to really maximize on my vulnerability. And it became a really hostile situation. And at that point, my parents had been divorced, so I wasn't shielded by my father's presence by the extent of toxicity that my mother could really lash out at me. And there were fights, right? There were fights that were taking place, and I tried my best to shield myself from it, but everything that I did was wrong, right? So even when I retreated and tried to stay in my own corner, there was a problem with that. And at that point, Project Purpose was still so new. And she wanted in on Project Purpose. And the more that I said no, the more she was angry, and it escalated to the point where I was like, I need to get out of here and I need to go no contact. I recognized at that point that my family dynamics were just so unhealthy. There was so much jealousy, so much competition that now wasn't just my mother towards me, it was emanating from all of my siblings towards me. Like, at this point, like, I not only had 2 undergraduate degrees, I had industry experience across different industries in the private sector. I had an international canvas because I just came back from working in digital consulting in France, and I had my own business. I think that there is a lot of unspoken success that still hadn't really translated in a way that I felt it was completely worth celebrating. Like, for me, it was still building, but for them, it was like, well, I went to an MBA at a reputable school. I have this business. Like, I should share the wealth, essentially. But the way that they went about it was really very unhealthy. It showed me how little regard that they had for me as well. And it became like a threatening environment. Like, they wanted Project Purpose to be a family business. I was never opposed to that. Like, I was like, well, let me give it time. Like, let's see it build in the vision that I had initially. And then from there, we'll discuss its evolution being more family oriented. Like, I had never said no, but she really wanted that commitment on paper, right? And because I was vulnerable, I didn't have a job yet. I was living in her home. I wasn't sure if I was going to stay in Canada or move to France. It was becoming this perfect storm, right? It became really very hostile. And I thought that because my mother worked as a mental health practitioner, because she had a lot of power, the way that she was behaving within 4 walls of her home, there was a lot of abuse of power. So I recognized that, like, as I left, she knew I was leaving for good. And because I understood that unhealthy dynamic, my mother saw my success as her success. Like, my success at that point, she was recognizing was independent of her, and she was trying to reinstate her sense of dominance by trying to have me commit to the things that I was building as part of what we were building. And because I was very much against that, I recognized that I was going to be punished for that. And so I did what I could to really shield myself from that punishment. And I knew she was going to react adversely. I didn't think, though, that it would be something that would be so known, right? Like, I didn't think that she would put herself in a position where be able to recognize that there was abuse taking place in the household. But when I decided to leave her house, I recognized that because she was most likely going to try to attack my mental health, because that was her wheelhouse, that was where she had power. And at that point, because of the pandemic, because of the amount of uncertainty and instability that I was dealing with in my life, like, it would have been believable, right? Like, any narrative she built that challenged my mental health would have been something that people could believe just because of the setting and the situation. So I decided to call my lawyer friends, right? Like, I wasn't going to allow there to be a he said, she said dynamic that took place. I knew that I needed to have reinforcement and professional reinforcement. I really didn't care to have someone there who had like lackluster credibility. I needed people who were credible to support me in leaving my mother's house, just because I knew of the war it was going to begin, because of what it was she was looking for from me that I wasn't ready to give her. And so the day that I left, I had my friend who was a lawyer pick me up. I also ended up calling the authorities just because I knew she was going to be angry, but I believe in prevention over the cure. I didn't want there to be any drama around me leaving, so I preferred to be safe rather than sorry and have the authorities present while I left my mother's home. It ended up being that 6 officers came up. I could not have foreseen that many officers were going to show up. I mean, I live in a very small rural neighborhood. I think that there was just many people who were off who didn't have anything else to do, but really it was there more prevention than cure. And so I was escorted out. I had my friend who was a lawyer support me in packing up all my belongings and moving out. And it was as seamless as can be. And that's because I spent 3 weeks planning it. I wanted to make sure that there were so many eyes on my exit, on my state of mind, that if she were to attack my mental health, like, I would be able to completely neutralize any of those statements and any of those rumors and that gossip immediately. And so, as expected, like, I knew my mother was going to have a conniption. I told her that my witness, the person who came and who was supporting me in exiting, was a lawyer, and she was my formal third-party witness to me exiting, and I think that sent her in a spiral. And as a result of that, she tried to have me formed. So in Ontario, there's 2 kinds of forms. There's a Form 1, which is where you are to be institutionalized, so you are forcibly returned to a mental health institution. And the second one is forcibly returned back to your home residence. So actually, my mother tried to have me forcibly returned back to her home residence, and luckily for me, I was able to curb it, completely neutralize it. I had my friend who was a lawyer completely support me and kiboshing that within 24 hours. But still, because the form went out, anyone who was connected to me professionally or otherwise most likely got a call from the authorities, as my mother was trying to find me to have me forcibly returned back home. And a lot of rumors ensued as a result of that. So even though for me, I was completely comfortable because I had really lined up my ducks in a row, because I anticipated that there was going to be some sort of backlash, because I am a survivor of narcissistic abuse. I know how these cycles go. And I knew that if it was a he said, she said dynamic, because of her power, because of her influence within the mental health arena, that she would definitely weaponize my mental health at that point in time. I think she was going to do everything she could to silence me, because she was seen as someone who was great with children, as someone who was empathetic, as someone who really was an advocate for mental health. What people do behind closed doors was completely the opposite. It would really destroy the image that she created. And so for me, I didn't really expect that she would take it to the extent that she would really have her own credibility on the line, but I don't think that she thought she was going to fail. I think she was very confident that she was going to be successful. She wasn't. I had to get a psych evaluation in order to neutralize the claims for the Form 2. So within 24 hours, all of it was tossed out, but it created a ripple effect for more rumors to ensue, right? And so I was fine. I didn't think that the rumors would carry much weight because they were founded on nothing. And normally, if you look at my medical records, I have never had a mental health crisis. And no insult to anyone who has, I just have never had a mental health crisis. I have never needed to take a pill. I've never had a mental health disorder, small or large. Anything that I've experienced, and I've had highs and lows in life, they're all within the realm of normalcy, right? My ability to adjust has always been something that's been adaptive enough that I haven't required, support by way of, being institutionalized. That's never happened. happened, medicated, that's never happened. Have I sought a therapist here and there? Absolutely. But dealing with life milestones, it was a point in time and then it was resolved, right? So the allegations and the claims that my mother made against me actually hurt her reputation and it put her own professional sort of status under threat, because when I was received my psych evaluation to toss out the allegations, the mental health professionals were like, okay, well, these allegations now, they're almost on the borderline criminal, right? Because they're just completely and utterly false. And I received evaluations from multiple mental health professionals so that it was able to get thrown out and never reinstated. And that is also why I've gone no contact, right? I think the final straw was before that took place, but I think that taking place formalized why my decision was the right decision to make. And it was no contact with my entire family, because I think that at that point in time, I've recognized that people in my family, they enabled my mother's behavior. It was just the norm. And I was the only one who didn't. And I couldn't continue to be the only one to stand up to and create boundaries and be the one fighting against my mother, exposing myself to being ripped down, in the way that she did, right? No mother would rip their child down if there was any basis of love there. And at that point in my adulthood, there was just so much envy and jealousy built around the fact that there was no ability for her to bridge her success with mine. There was just too much of a disconnect between the road that I had taken professionally and in my own life and the road that she had taken, that couldn't assume my success as her own, which is what she had done in previous years. But as I was maturing in my career and personally, there just became a lot more contempt and resentment for the way that I was living my life so freely. And that's just not something to be apologetic for. So I like to have these conversations around mental health, around mental wellness, and around education, because I think there's been so many conversations around those topics in my household. I think that they were talked about by people who still had a lot more healing to do, right? So I think that my parents were definitely the first to try to break down a lot of the trauma that they experienced. I think that they made a lot of traction, but I think that there is still a lot of trauma that they created with us, right? And I think that for me, as I think about my future and the family that I want to create, I think that the only way that I can do that is to really break from the traumatic bonds that were created really with my family members, so that I can really have a clean slate, because a lot of the trauma that I experienced was visceral trauma. I think that when you remove the root of the visceral trauma, you can start to really cleanse yourself. And I think that that's what I did, right? Even the MBA program was so all-consuming that it created really a healthy distance between me and my family structure. And then moving to France reinforced that distance, and I really just started to see things outside of the lens of my mother's power and domination, right? And I think that that was very threatening to her, to the point where I think that the love-hate relationship that we had just became really contemptuous and hateful. And I think what she did was deeply hateful. And I think that it's just important. I took the time to heal, to be able to have this conversation. But for all of you who are healing and who are dealing with narcissistic mothers and dealing with toxic dynamics with your mothers, I think that, all of us reach a point where enough is enough. And that's why I've gone no contact. But no contact with no ill will, right? I still forgive her. I recognize that a lot of why she behaves the way she does is because of the trauma that she has that is unhealed, that has reinforced the choices that she's made, that she's going to have to take accountability for at some point in time. So she doesn't need my resentment or my contempt or my anger on top of that. I prefer to reclaim that energy, to forgive her, but to let her go with love. And so that's the story behind me going no contact. And I think that that's the conversation I want to have here, because I think a lot of questions have been raised, but a lot of people have tried to really maximize on my mother's abuse. They really have tried to leverage that abuse to reinforce their position on trying to challenge my mental health. And I think that it's just so interesting how we have this duality of giving people permission and space to deal with mental health issues, but then we, on the second hand, try to weaponize people's mental health. And luckily for me, I have the right people in place to help me defend my mental health for those who are trying to weaponize it. So any claims, any comments, any rumors are easily kiboshed in the legal realm, and that's where I recognize I need to take it when it gets to the point where it's defamation and libel, and it's where I will take it. But it's just an interesting duality, because really, are we all that free to talk about our mental health issues? If when we don't have mental health issues, the best defense that someone has against us is to try to weaponize our mental health by neutralizing our voice, by trying to make us come across as people who have, mental health instability. So I think that that's an important conversation to have. I think it's a conversation I'm ready to have more frequently. It's probably going to be more so the second part of this series on education, a little bit more about me and why I like to have these conversations and why I think that these conversations are necessary. I think a lot of us come from high-functioning narcissistic family dynamics, and that's what I would call my own family dynamic. And I think that it's challenging, right? When the abuse isn't black and white, when the abuse isn't so vile and so bold and apparent that it's easily identified as abuse. And I think mine has been much more insidious, much more calculated in the way that it's formulated. And only in my adult years has it really translated in a way that's so aggressive that people still had questions about, well, is this abuse, or is Rochelle like actually dealing with like a mental health concern? And so the truth is, I've never had a mental health concern. I've never been institutionalized. I've never needed medication to support me with any mental health issues. And again, like, not discounting anyone who has. That's just not been my journey. But my journey has been that people have tried to use those allegations to discredit me and to silence my voice. And I think that's what I really want to make sure that more people have the tools to support themselves with, because there are so many victims out there of narcissistic families who have been completely silenced because their mental health has been weaponized in order for the narcissistic parents to maintain their image as being the good person, as being the one who requires the sympathy and the empathy. So this is me now speaking my truth about my own personal journey. It's been a while. It's been a long time coming. There's more to be said. Like, I still need to process before I speak. So this is the story that I needed to speak to, because I know that there's so many question marks in my own personal network, as I went no contact with so many people just to make sure that I could neutralize the claims and I could completely just nullify any sort of attempt to weaponize my mental health at that point in time. And I was working with lawyers. I had a lot of support in the way that I navigated that setting, clear-headed and sound of mind, of course. So that's the topic for today. I think that that's heavy, but I think it gives everyone the clarity that they're looking for, because I think that there's still, like, you know, like, people think that where there's smoke, there's fire. And I think that for the most part it's true, unless you're dealing with narcissistic abuse or any kind of abuse. I think the smoke and the fire is a signal of not the person who's being targeted, of not the victim, but of what that person has survived. And I think that it's very important for me to now put the line in the sand about what is true and what is not as it relates to me and my story and my journey. I have allowed, you know, wildfires to go for a really long time so that I can come on here and definitively, like, say, well, this is true and this is not. And I can support that, you know, with legal backing as well, if I need to anyway. But anyway, that's just the here and now conversation for those who are curious but didn't feel it was appropriate to ask. And I thank you to those of you who have given me space and who have given me the grace to not judge me prima facie, but to still have the questions. And I think that I was very harsh with the people who weren't sure what side of the coin to fall on, when I mean, now in retrospect, with hindsight, I'm like, well, I guess it's believable, right? Like, if you really don't have context, if you're not sure, then who knows, right? Like, we never know how and what people are dealing with behind closed doors, but now you know for sure what I am and what I am not dealing with, and what I was and was not suffering from, and definitely not mental health issues, but a lot of abuse, right? So I think that I can talk about abuse now from a personal perspective. I don't need to be so objective about it, because I feel like I've done enough of my own healing that I can personalize some of the advice that I give based on some of the experiences that I've had with all of you. In any case, that was it, but definitely not all. Now, before letting you go, I would be remiss if I didn't let you know that we will be going live at least twice a month, every month for the foreseeable future on our Facebook page. So definitely be sure to tune in. Now, these events are paid events, so if you do see yourself participating in our community on an ongoing basis, then I do suggest take a look at one of our package plans. Yes, so we do offer package plans over and above our live events, as well as access to webinars and workshops largely focused on self-mastery over and above these events. So make a point to tune in, join our game changer community, being part of the change that you want to see, allowing us a small role to play in your journey. We are on the road to 1K, so we invite all of you to give us a like, follow us across all of our social media platforms, and we look forward to chatting with all of you very soon. We'll talk to you later.
I just feel like no one's listening. Some days I just feel like the world's